I once thought the most dangerous thief was a stranger, but no, the real thief was the person who had slept beside me for 30 years. On the day the court ruled, I wasn't sentenced to prison. I was sentenced to losing my home, my children, and my dignity. They called it a lawful division. I called it the funeral of trust. If you've ever had something you spent your whole life building taken away, a home, a family, or simply the trust of the person you loved, then this story is for you. Because sometimes justice isn't in the verdict, but in the way we rise from the ashes. Before we begin, allow me to thank you, the one who is listening, who still believes the truth is worth protecting. Subscribe to the channel, share this story, and tell me where you're listening from. Who knows, maybe somewhere out there, your story will find its own justice too. That afternoon at the King County Courthouse in Seattle, sunlight slipped through the tall glass windows and fell onto the polished wooden floor, dividing the room into two sharp halves of light and shadow. I sat in the shadow. The microphone in front of the judge crackled softly. Then her voice rose, steady and cold like the sound of a heart monitor going flat. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and the psychological evaluation, the court rules. I heard every word clearly, as if hearing my own hanging sentence. All marital assets between Mr. Richard Ashford and Mrs. Lorraine Ashford, including 3 real properties in Everett, Kirkland, and Bellevue, along with all vehicles and accounts totaling $9,500,000, shall be temporarily transferred for management and legal title to Mrs. Lorraine Ashford to ensure financial safety for the party deemed psychologically affected and emotionally distressed. One word, temporarily, yet it hit my ear like the slam of a prison gate. The court said temporary, but everyone in that room, from the clerk to the reporters to the attorneys, knew I had just been stripped of everything. The court orders temporary asset management granted to Mrs. Lorraine and mandates a compulsory 60-day psychological and capacity assessment and issues a temporary protective order limiting direct contact with both children until the evaluation is complete. Her voice was gentle like a passing breeze, but every syllable sliced through me. Rebecca, the daughter who used to leap onto my back as a child, sat in the back row, eyes red but avoiding mine. Daniel, the son I once taught to write his first job application, sat still, his hand resting on his mother's shoulder as if shielding her from me. Lorraine was different. She sat straight, hands loosely clasped, wearing the white pearl necklace I gave her for our 30th anniversary. In the fading yellow light of the afternoon, the pearl caught a dim shine like a fake smile. When the judge struck the gavel and declared, "This order is effective, immediately," the dry crack echoed in my skull like nails hammered into a coffin lid. Eleanor Cho, my attorney, placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Rick, we'll appeal. There is still a way." I looked her directly in the face. "Have you ever seen justice side with someone labeled an abuser?" She didn't answer. She simply stayed silent. And in that silence I heard a faint laugh from across the courtroom. Martin Cole, Lorraine's attorney, leaned in to whisper something into her ear. She nodded slightly, lips curving. Not the smile of victory. No, it was the smile of execution. I stood. Behind me, the benches rustled, the sound of people rising from a hearing they believed was righteous. Sunset slanted through the window and hit the judge's bench, turning her expressionless face into a bronze statue. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain and wet asphalt. I stepped down the stone stairs, listening to the steady clack of my shoes like a countdown. The paper briefcase in my hand felt suddenly heavy. Inside were the receipts of a lifetime that now meant nothing. The courthouse door swung open behind me. Lorraine walked out, the last light of day forming a faint halo around her hair. She approached, her heels tapping short, icy beats. "See?" she said softly, though her words cut the air. "I'm only listed temporarily. But honestly, Rick, At our age, temporary might as well mean forever. I stared straight into her eyes. Aren't you afraid justice might wake up someday? Lorraine smiled, thin and sharp as a blade. Justice doesn't wake up, Rick. It sleeps on money, and I have enough to keep it sleeping. Martin opened the door of a white Tesla. She got in, looked back at me through the tinted glass, and lifted her hand in a small wave. The electric engine hummed, then faded into the street. I remained on the steps, alone. To my right, Puget Sound shimmered. To my left, the courthouse with its engraved words, King County Superior Court, in the pursuit of justice. The wind blew, rattling the metal plate, the sunset tinting the letters, gold mixed with blood red. I sat on the stone step and set the briefcase beside me. Inside were a few old documents and a leather notebook, where I had written my first design sketches back when I worked as an engineer at Boeing. Now those drawings were nothing more than relics of misplaced trust. I opened the notebook. On the first page was a line I wrote at age 30. Justice can be bought, but memory cannot. I read it again and again until my eyes blurred. The cold wind stung my face, and I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from emptiness. I once thought I had everything. A home, a wife, children, dignity. But now, sitting on the cold courthouse steps, I had nothing left except breath and memory. A pigeon landed on the railing, then flew off, leaving a streak of white on the gray stone. Simple, indifferent, exactly how the world treats the defeated. I lifted my head toward the sun sinking behind the cascades. The last light flared on the courthouse glass, glowed briefly, then died. Everything fell into ash-colored dimness. In that moment, I understood something. They hadn't killed me. They had buried me alive, assuming I would stay silent forever. But they forgot that in the dark, the only thing left is memory, and memory has a longer lifespan than any court order. I stood, buttoned my vest, and looked at the courthouse one last time. A whole life packed into one afternoon. A man brought down not by weapons, but by trust placed in the wrong hands. I turned and walked away. In my pocket, the silver pen, our 10th anniversary gift, pressed cold against my chest. I thought, maybe one day it will sign another order, the order of the truth. I reopened the old album. Its leather cover had faded, and the corners curled from moisture. The first photo was the house in Everett, taken in the summer of 1987, the white painted front, green window frames, and a lawn still patched with fresh soil. In the picture, I was smiling, holding a paintbrush, my shirt stained with gray splatters. Lorraine stood on the steps, her brown hair lifted gently, holding a bouquet of lavender. That was the first day we stepped into the home called Ashford Residence. The smell of fresh paint, soil, and a beginning. Back then, I was a structural engineer at Boeing, newly promoted to project lead. The salary wasn't as high as people imagined, but it was enough for me to buy each plank of wood and every bag of cement. I poured the concrete for the backyard myself, planted the flagpole, and welded a small stainless steel plate. Ashford Residence, built 1987. It was the first time in my life that I felt I truly had a place to call home. Lorraine was nothing like the woman the court described. She was smart, witty, and always made others feel a little smaller whenever she smiled. She once said, "You build bridges for people to cross, and I will build the home where you rest." That sentence followed me for 30 years, and still echoes whenever I look at the ceiling she now owns. In those early years, life was simple. In the morning, I drove Lorraine to her accounting office on Pine Street, and in the afternoon, she picked me up at the factory gate. At night, we ate homemade Italian pasta, listened to Sinatra, and talked about our dream of buying a cabin near Union Lake. When Rebecca was born, I made her crib from leftover porch lumber. 2 years later, Daniel came to us, the boy who loved taking everything apart, including my alarm clock. I wasn't angry. I just laughed, just like his father. The house grew with the children. I added an attic, built a reading room for Lorraine, relaid the floors with pine, and planted rows of red maples along the fence. Every autumn the leaves fell like rain, covering the walkway, a beauty I thought would never fade. Then time started changing colors. I remember the first time I saw Lorraine leave her phone on the table. The screen lit up. "See you at the old place this afternoon, M," I asked, and she simply smiled, saying it was a partner in a financial project. I believed her. People believe what lets them stay peaceful, not what is true. After that came the late meetings. The business trips were shorter but more expensive. Her eyes, when I asked about the bank, were no longer the eyes of someone sharing. They were the eyes of someone hiding. One October night, I woke up because I heard a whisper in the living room. Lorraine was on the phone, her voice low and quick. "Don't worry, he doesn't suspect anything. I'll handle that account." I stood in the hallway, listening to the rain tapping lightly against the window. She hung up, turned, and saw me. I only asked, "Who were you talking to?" She smiled gently. "An old client. Are you jealous?" I stayed silent. She stepped closer, her hand on my chest, her warm smile, a velvet-wrapped blade. From that day, I watched every bill and every strange expense. Financial consulting project, $7,200. Conference fees, $5,400. The numbers started speaking in place of people, but I stayed quiet. I thought that if love was a house, there had to be space for doubt to wait outside the door. Another night, I came home late. The wind from the bay was strong, carrying the damp metallic scent of the Everett Bridge on my coat. When I opened the gate, the house was dark, except for a pale blue glow from the living room. Lorraine sat alone, hair loose, her bare shoulders trembling slightly under a thin robe. She smiled, a smile I had never seen. Then I heard a man's voice coming from her phone speaker, low and intimate. "I miss you, Lori. I still have the clip from when you tried on that dress at the Bellevue Hotel." Every word hit me like shards of glass. Lorraine tilted her head and whispered, "Don't say that. You're scaring me. You know he still thinks I'm at the investment board meeting." His voice dropped lower. "Then let him keep thinking that. A man can build an entire house, but that doesn't mean he knows who's living in it." Lorraine laughed softly. "I only need a few more months. When the court rules, everything will be under my name. Then I'm free." I froze on the porch. Rain soaked through my clothes, the wind pressing salt against my skin. I didn't know I had just witnessed a death, not of a person, but of trust. I pushed the door open, the hinge letting out a faint creak. The room was filled with her familiar perfume, the one she used with me, now suffocatingly strong. On the table sat a half-empty wine glass, a clear red lipstick mark on the rim. Her phone lay face down, its faint light blinking before going dark. I looked at everything, the chair where I read the paper, the blanket she used, everything unchanged except for one truth. I had become a spare part in my own home. That night, we still slept in the same bed. She faced away from me, and I stared into the dark. No words, no sobbing, only the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and cold. People say betrayal makes noise, but all I heard was silence, the kind that can crush your lungs. Now, sitting alone in this tiny rented apartment years later, I still remember the blue light on Lorraine's face that night, cold but beautiful, the beauty of perfect deceit. The last photo in the album was from our 20th anniversary. I wore a gray suit, and Lorraine wore a red dress. Rebecca and Daniel stood between us, both smiling brightly. To anyone else, it looked like a happy family. But if you look closely, you'll see my hand only barely touching hers. Not holding, not squeezing, just touching for show. That small gap, I now know, was the first crack in a house. I closed the album. The back of my hand was dusty. The lamp reflected a trembling line of light. I told myself in the dark, I built this home with my hands, with trust, with the years I gave wholeheartedly. And she destroyed it with a smile, a weapon that leaves no wound, yet kills the slowest. From that night on, everything in the house began to change, not through arguments, but through silence. Lorraine didn't avoid me, but every time I stepped into her room, she turned to stone, her eyes freezing in midair as she quietly slipped her phone into her pocket, as if it were nothing more than a reflex. We still ate dinner together, still sat in the same two old chairs by the maple table, but our conversations had shrunk into thin fragments. Where's the salt? In the cabinet? It's raining today. Yeah. And then silence. Only the sound of cutlery hitting the plates, sharp as metal, striking the heart. The house seemed to know what was happening. The photos on the wall, once memories, now looked down at me like silent witnesses to a betrayal. I began counting the days she left early and came home late. The excuses were still investment project, team meeting, therapy session. A new name appeared on the calendar she forgot on the table. Therapy, Emser Cole. 3 short words, but I knew they weren't just the name of a therapist. I said nothing. An engineer needs evidence, not instinct. I still went to work as usual, still came home on time, but inside, every thread of the marriage was snapping, quietly, steadily. One evening I left work early. The drizzle and the mist from the Everett Bridge blurred my windshield. When I stopped in the driveway, the porch light flickered, its weak yellow glow like the breath of someone dying. I stepped carefully and opened the door. Lorraine stood with her back to me in the living room, the phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was soft but clear in the unnervingly quiet room. He still doesn't suspect a thing. I froze. Every word hit the floor like metal. She paused for a few seconds, then continued, "Just keep it quiet until the papers are ready." After that, I heard nothing else, only the rain against the window and the blood rushing through my ears. I backed out onto the porch. The rain fell harder, the wind blowing out the light. The entire front yard sank into darkness, except for the faint blue glow spilling from inside, the light that once shone on the face of the woman I loved, now illuminating a stranger. I looked at the house I had built with my hands, poured every bag of cement into it, and it felt like a body, stripped of its soul. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring through the fog glass. Outside, the red maples were soaked in rain, their leaves falling in clumps. I remembered the times, she said, "I trust you," when I worked far away, and remembered how she held my hand before every major design presentation. And now, those same hands were preparing to sign papers to take everything away. The next morning, after Lorraine left the house, I called Frank Douglas, an old friend who used to be a company lawyer. Frank was 10 years older than me, retired now, living in northern Seattle. Hearing my voice, he stayed silent for a moment, then asked bluntly, "Rick, what did she do?" "I don't know yet, but I heard enough to know something bad is coming." Frank sighed, his voice heavy as old steel. "If you're suspicious, don't ask. Asking just makes them better liars. Hire someone to find out. You need the truth, not an explanation." "Who can I trust, Frank?" "I'll introduce you to one special guy. He worked for me back when I practiced law. Discreet, clean, never betrays his client. His name is Colton Reeves. Tell no one, not even your kids." I wrote the number in my old notebook and set the phone down. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was faint, but cut like a wound. That evening I sat on the porch again. The rain kept falling, steady as the heartbeat of suspicion. The yard light flickered, its reflection on the wet brick wall forming a warped shadow. My face, older, more tired and lonelier. I understood then that sometimes trust doesn't die because of betrayal, but because of the silence we choose to keep for the sake of dignity. I looked at the house, every brick I laid, every window frame I measured, now hiding something I couldn't touch. I inhaled, tasting the cold of metal and rain on my tongue, then whispered to myself, "I once thought silence was a sign of trust. Turns out it was just a place for lies to grow." Thinking back now, maybe that was the moment I stopped believing in luck. Everything began on a rainy Seattle morning when I met the man named Colton Reeves, the one who made me understand that truth never sleeps. It just waits to be paid its proper price. Seattle in December was drenched without pause. On the Baim, slick streets glowing under streetlights, I sat in a small cafe on the corner of Fifth Avenue, the smell of coffee mixing with the damp chill of wet raincoats. The door opened, and a man walked in. Long black coat, broad shoulders, cold eyes. He took off his hat, set an old leather notebook on the table, and said briefly, "You're Rick Ashford?" I nodded. "Colton Reeves, former Seattle PD. Frank Douglas said you needed me." Colton pulled out a faded badge, the words Detective Division still visible. His voice was low, rough, without pretense. "I don't need to know your family issues. I only care about evidence. If someone is lying, I'll find it." I replied, "I don't need to clear my name. I just want the truth to speak." We sat under the yellow light spilling through the fogged window. Colton opened his notebook, wrote a few lines, then asked, "Who do you suspect?" "Lorraine, my wife, and Martin Cole, her attorney." Colton looked up, his eyes sharp as a blade. "Martin Cole? I've investigated him before. Specializes in staging fake victim cases in high-asset divorces. He hides his tracks well, but no one stays clean forever." 3 days later, Colton texted, "There's something you need to see." I went to his small apartment on Capitol Hill. On the laptop screen was clear footage. Lorraine leaving the Bellevue Hotel wearing a white coat and a black knit hat. Beside her was Martin Cole. He touched her back lightly, smiling with the ease of longtime lovers. I stood frozen. Colton rewound and zoomed in on Lorraine getting into the car. He said, "This is a video I recorded yesterday. They've been meeting for 2 months, usually on Thursday nights." He pulled out an envelope filled with restaurant receipts, hotel invoices, and bank statements. Regular consulting fee transfers from Lorraine's account to Cole Strategic Group, LLC. Colton's voice stayed flat, like reading charges in court. "This company is registered under Martin Cole. Look, those payments she calls personal financial consulting are actually going to him, not for any project, but for building a case, a file designed to turn you into the guilty party." I held the statement, my eyes landing on the note. "Therapy session, private." Colton continued, cold as steel. "To be direct, they're crafting a story, and if this runs its course, in a few months they'll file, with enough evidence to take everything from you. The numbers on the page look like oil stains, impossible to clean. Receipts, invoices, accounts, all tiny pieces forming a perfect conspiracy." He asked quietly, "Anything else?" Colton nodded, took out a small silver USB. "This is the recording, 11 days ago at Pier 76 Bar. I planted a mic in the table. Listen." The speaker played Lorraine's voice, soft and calm. "We have to prepare carefully. He's an engineer, and he likes evidence. If we want the court to believe, there must be traces. And traces we can create." Martin's quiet laugh followed. "I can handle the rest. You just need to act well." I sat motionless. Every word in the recording fell like someone peeling the skin off my chest. The room seemed to shrink, leaving only the sound of rain against the window. Colton shut the laptop and looked straight at me. "Mr. Ashford, they're writing a script, and you're the villain in it." I didn't speak. I lifted the cold cup of coffee, its bitterness hitting my nose. "What do I do now?" Colton replied, voice cutting. "Stay silent. Let them think you're still naive. I'll gather more evidence. When we go to court, we drop everything at once. Then they'll collapse." That night, I called Frank Douglas. I summarized everything, sent him the photos of the receipts and Colton's transcript. Frank read it all and said, "Tell no one. If you reveal it now, they'll file a privacy violation and everything gets thrown out. Let them dig their own grave." I sat by the apartment window, looking at Seattle, drowned in rain. Headlights glowed on the glass, reflecting my face. Thin, worn, but with an unusual sharpness in my eyes. I reopened the screen and stared at the photo of Lorraine standing beside Martin under the blue light of the Bellevue Hotel. She was smiling, a soft, confident, ruthless smile. I whispered, voice low as wind over a bridge, "Justice isn't dead, it's just in the dark." I turned on the printer, each sheet sliding out in a steady rhythm. Receipts, photos, recordings, bank evidence, each one numbered carefully. I placed everything into a thick envelope, sealed it with brown tape, and wrote in black ink, "Ashford Evidence Pack 01." I looked at the envelope under the desk lamp, the yellow light turning the letters faint like steel. I exhaled, turned off the lamp, and in that darkness the rain kept falling, tapping like the drumbeat of a counterstrike already underway. I still remember the cold of that morning clearly. Seattle was drowned in fog, and the King County Courthouse rose like a massive block of stone in the middle of the street. The steps were wet with rain, each footstep echoing hollowly like the knock of a verdict already decided. I walked through the heavy metal door, through the security scanner, past the indifferent eyes of the guards, and entered the room where, just 1 week earlier, I still believed justice would be found. Before stepping inside the courtroom, Frank Douglas stopped beside the cold hallway, his hand on my shoulder. He spoke quietly, his voice deep and firm like old steel. "Rick, I know you want to reveal everything Colton found, but if you submit it now, you'll lose in the first minute." I frowned. "Why?" "It's the truth, Frank. The video, the statements, the recordings, they prove they staged this divorce." Frank looked around, lowered his voice. "Washington is a two-party consent state. The law requires both sides to agree to any recording. The recordings Colton made will be considered illegal evidence. If we submit them, Martin Cole will counter with a privacy violation claim, and the judge will throw out the entire file." He paused, his eyes sharp. "Not to mention he'll use that to paint you as the violator. One move, and you lose everything." I stayed silent. The rain outside tapped slowly on the window, like marking the rhythm of a sentence already written. Frank continued, "The only way is to let them strike first. They'll submit fabricated documents, and that's when we drop the Ashford Evidence Pack 01. Then the real evidence won't just expose fraud, it will qualify for a criminal claim of fraud upon the court." He sighed. "Today you'll have to endure humiliation, but remember, the humiliation of today is the proof of tomorrow." I nodded, feeling as if someone had poured lead into my chest. I put the thick envelope back into my case, locked it, and whispered, "I understand. If I must stay silent, so justice can speak at the right time, I'll stay silent." The courtroom was vast. The ceiling was high, cold fluorescent lights shining down on every detail. The wooden tables, the steel columns, the unfamiliar faces. I sat at the defense table, a small microphone and a cup of cold water in front of me. Lorraine sat across the room, wearing a pale gray dress, her makeup perfect, her hair falling lightly just enough to hide half her expression. Beside her was Martin Cole, the man I once considered a respectable figure in the legal world, now the architect of the pit meant to bury my name. When the judge entered, everyone stood. Chairs scraped the floor in unison, then silence. The hearing began. Martin stood first, straightened his tie, and spoke with a steady, confident voice. "Your Honor, today we are not just here to discuss assets, but to protect a woman who has lived in fear for 30 years. I lifted my head. Each word he uttered stabbed like an icy blade into bone. On the screen behind him, photos appeared. A bruise on Lorraine's wrist, a piece of paper with my handwriting listing monthly expenses, and an email cropped at the top and bottom. "You must follow the plan, or everything will fall apart." Martin pointed to the screen and said clearly, "This is proof that Mr. Rick Ashford controlled his wife's life down to the smallest detail. He wasn't just an engineer at work. He was the engineer of control in his marriage." I looked closely at the photos. They were manipulated, The wall behind Lorraine wasn't my house, but a Bellevue hotel room, and that paper was one of my financial notes to help her manage expenses after she stopped working. But no one asked that. They only saw what Martin wanted them to see. Then the witnesses came one by one. An old neighbor claiming to have heard arguments. A co-worker said Lorraine once came to work distressed. A psychologist, I had never heard the name, stated that Lorraine shows signs of trauma from living in a controlled environment. Everything flowed smoothly, flawlessly, too flawlessly. Frank tried to object, but every time he spoke, Martin cut in, "Objection irrelevant," and each time the judge simply nodded, "Sustained." The scales of justice tilted slowly, inch by inch, toward the one who knew how to play the victim. Lorraine bowed her head, clutching a tissue, occasionally lifting it to dab the corner of her eye. I knew she wasn't crying. She was checking to make sure her mascara hadn't smudged. She had planned even that. When it was her turn to speak, she stood, her voice trembling just enough to be believable. "I just want peace, Your Honor. I tried to keep this family together for 30 years, but he made me afraid of my own home." She paused, looked up, her tears sparkling exactly as the overhead lights hit them. The entire courtroom went silent. The judge, a middle-aged woman with silver hair tied back, looked at Lorraine and said firmly, "We must protect the vulnerable." I glanced at Frank. He squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "We'll appeal." But I could see the helplessness in his eyes. I looked around, the reporters, the curious spectators, a few old co-workers, all staring at me with pity. They didn't see the man who built bridges across rivers. They saw the abuser the media had molded in just 2 weeks. When the hearing paused, the judge said calmly, "The preliminary decision will be announced at the end of the month." A single gavel strike followed, dry, cold, like a coffin lid closing. I stood and walked outside. Seattle's rain poured heavily. I didn't open an umbrella. Each drop hitting my face and shoulders felt like the price of silence. At the courthouse entrance, Lorraine was talking to Martin. He said something that made her laugh, a light laugh with no trace of the tears she showed inside. The sight burned into my mind like a brand that would never fade. I walked down the steps, my footsteps blending with the rain. I didn't know how long I walked. I only knew each step felt like carrying the ruins of my home on my back. I looked up at the gray building, its tall stone columns like monuments to deceit. I whispered, unsure if I was speaking to myself or to the world, "Justice is still there. Only the one holding the gavel has closed their eyes." On the day the court issued the temporary ruling, I knew I had officially lost the home I had laid brick by brick 30 years ago. Not because I lost, but because they had decided beforehand that I must lose. Lorraine was given temporary management rights over all assets until the final hearing was completed. But everyone knew that meant I was being forced out of my own roof. I spent 2 days packing. 12 cardboard boxes sat neatly in the living room, each labeled carefully like a funeral ritual. Technical books, family photos, old tools, Daniel's airplane models, Rebecca's albums, Tacoma Bridge blueprints. I wrapped each frame in old newspaper, turning over the family photos that were now nothing more than evidence of a lie crafted too well. When I unscrewed the small steel plaque reading Ashford Residence, built 1987, the screwdriver trembled in my hand. I had carved those letters myself with a hand milling tool, each stroke carrying the sweat of a man who believed a house could hold love. Now the plaque was just a relic. I left almost everything behind, taking only 12 boxes, a small suitcase, and the old model airplane I built with Daniel when he was 8. The balsa wood plane still had a smear of blue paint on its left wing. I remembered the day we tested it in the backyard, him chasing it and laughing when it crashed into his mother's lavender patch. I kept it not because it was a beautiful memory, but because it was the only thing in my life that had never lied to me. News spread faster than I expected. 2 days later, online outlets simultaneously posted, "Former Boeing engineer accused of domestic abuse." The photo they used was of me walking out of the courthouse in the rain, head down, face blurred with water, eyes exhausted. Online, people commented, judged, and mocked. Co-workers who once shook my hand at Boeing went silent. Neighbors avoided my eyes. Old friends stopped messaging. I called Rebecca, my daughter. The phone rang 7 times, then died. Daniel sent one short line. "Dad, I'm sorry, but this is complicated. I'll call later." I understood. In a sea of fake headlines, silence is how the weak protect themselves. I didn't blame them. I just sat in the empty room, listening to the tape sealing the boxes, feeling like I was packaging away my own life. In the days that followed, I lived on the small amount left in my personal account. The money Lorraine hadn't frozen yet. When the balance fell to under $2,000, I started looking for work. A Boeing engineer with 30 years of experience, but at 62, no company wanted to hire someone branded domestic abuser. I walked through dozens of workshops with a wrinkled resume and received nothing but headshakes. Eventually, a small contractor in Renton took pity and let me do labor work on a construction site, $14 an hour, paid daily. I accepted immediately without asking questions. On the first day, I stood in the rain in a torn reflective vest, hauling bags of cement up a slope. The back that once bent over blueprints now bent under real weight. Younger men half my age joked as they worked, glancing at me occasionally, probably unaware that the gray-haired man beside them had once been the lead engineer at Boeing Everett, the one who calculated the structures of bridges that connected the state. I had no intention of telling them, "Here, dignity had no value beyond the strength of your hands." Every evening I took the late bus back to the small apartment. The pay was enough for a bit of food, the electric bill, and rent. No one called, no one asked. One night, while washing my hands, I looked into the mirror and saw my face darkened, with sunken eyes. My hands were calloused, nails chipped, tiny cracks filled with cement dust, proof of a man trying to survive in a world that no longer had a place for him. I laughed without sound, the laugh of someone who has nothing left except the memory that he once built homes, not someone thrown out of one. It was on a night like that I opened my father's keepsake box, an act that seemed pointless, yet became the moment that turned the tide. In those nights in the rented apartment in South Seattle, the smell of damp walls mixed with old paint and the sound of water leaking through pipes. I ate dinner from a can of soup with no salt and no flavor. Through the thin wall, the couple next door fought, doors slamming, dishes breaking. I sat still, listening. Maybe that was the real sound of life, raw, loud, and not performed for anyone. On the table, a small lamp shone onto a pile of old papers. I opened one of the boxes, still unsealed. Father's keepsakes. Inside were a few notebooks, a dark wooden box, and a black and white photo of my grandfather, Harold Ashford, the man who ran a small mechanical workshop in Tacoma, the first foundation of our family. In the wooden box, I found an old bank ledger, leather fading with faint letters. Ashford Heritage Trust, 1950. I opened it and saw his slanted handwriting. Money should not be a sword, but a wind. A sword kills. A wind changes direction. Below was the Rainier Bank stamp, labeled Active Trust. My heart suddenly beat faster, not because of money, but because I felt the Ashford bloodline was not dead. It was simply waiting for someone willing to stand up and reclaim justice in their own way. I closed the ledger and leaned against the wall, looking out the rain-soaked window. Streetlights reflected on the glass, splitting into hundreds of shimmering fragments, like shards of memory I had never been brave enough to gather. I whispered, almost only for the wind to hear. Maybe our family's justice was never lost. It was just waiting for someone desperate enough to find it. Outside, the Seattle rain kept falling, steady and sorrowful, But somewhere within that rhythm I heard another beat, the faint echo of hope waking up. That morning, Seattle was drowned in relentless rain. The air wasn't very cold, but the dampness of this place made the skin feel as if it were coated in a thin mist. I put on my old wool coat, carrying the bank ledger I had found the night before. Ashford Heritage Trust, 1950. The silver letters had faded, but the Rainier Bank seal remained intact, as if it had waited 7 decades just to be opened this morning. The Rainier Bank building sat in downtown Seattle, on Pike Street. Its white marble facade, tall pillars, and eagle-carved cornices carried the heavy, dignified look of American banks from the 1950s. I stepped into the lobby, my shoes gliding slightly on the wet stone floor, mixed with the smell of roasted coffee from the counter inside and the familiar sound of receipt printers. The young receptionist smiled when I showed her the old ledger. I want to check this account. It may have been closed, but I need to know." She flipped through the book, looked at the year on the cover, and frowned. 1950? She whispered. "I've never seen a ledger this old. Please wait a moment." She walked to the back, leaving me alone in the wide lobby. Light reflected off the stone floor, long streaks stretching like time being pulled taut. I heard the rain tapping lightly on the skylight above, each drop falling like the ticking of a clock, marking memory. 10 minutes later, a middle-aged man appeared, a dark blue suit, gray tie, and the calm demeanor of someone experienced. He introduced himself. "I'm the branch manager, Matthew. Would you follow me to a private office?" His voice was gentle but firm. Something in his eyes told me this was no longer a simple, forgotten account. Matthew's office was at the end of a stone-lined hallway. When the door closed, the scent of leather and coffee filled the air. He sat down, opened his computer, placed the ledger on the table, and said, "I just checked the original Rainier Bank records. This account, not only was it never closed, but it has been categorized as a long-term active trust. Do you know who opened it?" I swallowed, my voice turning hoarse. "Mr. Harold Ashford, my grandfather." Matthew nodded. "Then congratulations, Mr. Ashford. This account was invested through a compounded trust fund mechanism. The bank reinvests the principal interest every 3 years, from 1950 until now." He turned the screen toward me. The number on the display left me frozen. $132,407,891.62. This sum belongs to a conditional beneficiary trust, created in 1950 by my predecessor. Due to a payout clause requiring the beneficiary to reaffirm professional competence and moral integrity, this asset has remained locked for decades and was concealed by the family. I stared, thinking I must have read it wrong. Could this be a mistake? Matthew smiled, the kind of smile of someone used to witnessing lottery winner reactions. "No, sir. The account is still registered under Ashford Heritage Trust, and the designated beneficiary is clearly listed in the original file. It is you." I sat silently, listening to the rain outside the glass. Raindrops streamed down in connected lines, as if the years of humiliation had been nothing more than a prelude to this moment. Matthew opened a drawer and took out an old yellow envelope sealed with red wax, embossed with the initials H.A. I recognized my grandfather's carving instantly. This was attached to the original file. By regulation, the bank could only release it once the account was confirmed active. I think now is the time. My hands trembled as I received it. The wax seal was brittle, but the handwriting remained clear. "To the one who carries the Ashford name, the one who will read this when trust in the world has shattered." I sat still for a long moment, then broke the seal. Inside was a sheet of paper written in blue ink, each slanted stroke steady with the hand of an old mechanic. If the person reading these lines carries the Ashford name, then perhaps our bloodline continues, and that person has reached the moment when trust in the world has shattered. I do not know who you are, what era you live in, or what kind of America you inhabit. But if this ledger has reached your hands, it means you are standing at a crossroads. One side is anger, the other is justice. In 1948, I was betrayed. My partner forged my signature, seized all assets, and left me with nothing. But I learned one thing. Money is not a sword, but a wind. A sword can kill, but the wind changes direction. It can turn the whole world if used at the right moment. I leave here the last remaining part of my life, not for you to be rich, but for you to have a choice. When you are betrayed, let this money be the wind, pushing the truth back to where it belongs. But if you use it for revenge, then everything I ever believed in will die a second time. Justice is not always in the courthouse, but it is always in the hands of those who keep themselves from becoming the villain. If you can read these lines, I believe you are that person. Harold Ashford, Tacoma, June, 1950. I stopped reading. Tears fell onto the paper, smudging the old blue ink. In my mind rang the metallic echoes of the years my grandfather had stood in his workshop among the smell of oil, sweat, and belief in justice. Matthew gently asked, "Would you like to transfer the funds into your personal account?" I shook my head and whispered, "Not yet. I'm not ready." I left the bank in the gray rain of Pike Street. At my feet, puddles reflected the red lights of buses, spreading like streaks of blood. But inside, for the first time in months, I no longer felt cold. I held the red wax envelope tightly, feeling the warmth of the paper inside. My grandfather, or perhaps any Ashford who came before, had seen farther than a single lifetime. He didn't just leave money. He left a reminder that justice, when not found in court, sometimes sleeps in a bank, waiting for someone desperate enough to wake it. I looked up at the sky, the rain still pouring, and whispered with a bitter smile, "Justice isn't dead, it's just asleep, in a bank." The morning in Seattle was soaked with rain. I returned to the old office of Frank Douglas, the man who had represented me in the divorce case almost 1 year ago. The oak door looked the same, the nameplate already faded, but the smell of paper, ink, and leather remained exactly as before. Frank looked up when I stepped in, his eyes still the same, tired but honest, as if he had never left that battle. When he saw me, his eyes suddenly lit up, and he said, "I suspected sooner or later we would meet again. We still have a lot of unfinished work." I then placed the thick file on the table. Colton's photos of Lorraine and Martin at the Bellevue Hotel, the bank statements bearing the name Cole Strategic Group, LLC, the recording and preliminary testimony. Frank put on his glasses, opened each page, and stayed silent for a long time. Each time he turned to the next page, the sound of dry paper echoed in the heavy air. Finally he looked up, his voice lowering. "I suspected from the first day, Rick. These papers are not clean. The typing style, the ink pattern, and the date stamps are all off." He sighed. "Back then I said I wanted to verify them, but you still believed in the fairness of the court. It was very fortunate that you listened to me and didn't submit all of this. Now it is time to see whether their justice can stand." I sat still, hearing only the rain hitting the window. Frank stood up, opened the cabinet, and took out an old folder covered in dust. On the cover were faded labels. Cole V. Foster, 2018. Nguyen V. Keller, 2019. Morrison v. Cole, 2020. 7 divorce cases with the same pattern, he said slowly. Always women represented by Martin Cole. The man was accused of emotional abuse and lost all assets. After that, the money flowed into a private fund under a shell company name, Cole Strategic Group. He is not just a lawyer, Rick, but the architect of a fraud assembly line. Frank looked at me, his eyes stern but bright. "Do you still keep everything Colton collected?" I nodded, taking from my pocket the sealed envelope. He placed it beside the old files, arranging them neatly into 2 stacks. "So we have 2 halves of the picture. Now we need the third, the survivors. The first person we visited was Evelyn Foster, 52 years old, a retired teacher. Her apartment in Tacoma was small, with worn curtains and warm yellow light from the lamp. When I mentioned the name Martin Cole, her hand trembled, the teacup fell, and water splashed everywhere. "He destroyed my life," she said, her voice hoarse. "He told me to transfer my assets temporarily to avoid litigation, and then those very documents became evidence that I was financially incompetent. The court ruled against me, and I didn't even know how I had lost." I showed her the photos of Lorraine and Martin in Bellevue. She froze. "This woman, I've seen her. She once came to Martin's office. He called her Lori." The air in the room hardened. Frank quietly placed his hand on the folder and said softly, "Enough. This testimony is worth more than any document." The next witness was Rosen Guyen, a nail salon owner in Kent, 43 years old. She greeted us with a strained smile, the kind of smile of someone who has cried until dry. "Mr. Cole said he would help me get a divorce quickly, told me to sign a few temporary asset holding papers. 3 weeks later, the bank took my house, and he disappeared." She opened a cabinet and took out a stack of old faxes. The paper edges yellowed. The first line read clearly, "From Cole Strategic Group, LLC." "I kept them for years. I knew someone would need them someday. If you are that person, take them." Frank sealed the documents and stamped them red. Rosa looked at me, her voice tightening. "You're not the only victim, but you might be the last person he ever does this to." Over 6 weeks, we traveled across Washington State, from Kent to Bellevue, from Tacoma to Everett, meeting every person trapped by Martin's schemes. Each story was the same: a promise, a few power of attorney papers, a fake psychologist, a few hired witnesses, and the end was bankruptcy. Frank recorded Colton-verified identities, and Kingsley, the forensic specialist Frank had introduced, analyzed signatures and document metadata. When everything was assembled, the picture appeared clearly, like a technical blueprint. Martin Cole had constructed multiple victim-fabricated divorce cases to seize assets, splitting the gains with partners and shell companies. Each case was a bridge built with the same structure. The foundation was lies, the pillars were forged documents, and the deck was a reputation exploited. One evening, Frank and I sat at a table full of documents, the room lit only by a dim yellow desk lamp. I linked the photos with a red string, Martin in the center, surrounded by the faces of the people he had harmed. Elaine, Rosa, Morrison, Keller, each name a crack in the blueprint of his crimes. Frank looked at the board for a long time, then said, "Now do you understand, Rick? The bridge he built is a bridge of deceit. But if you strike the right load-bearing pillar, the entire structure will collapse." I looked at Lorraine, her once familiar face now existing only in the file. My voice deepened. Every bridge has a center of gravity, and his center is the habit of believing no one dares to speak the truth again. Frank gave a slight smile, placing his hand on my shoulder. "He once used words to bring down other people's homes. Now we will use the truth to rebuild." I nodded. Outside, the rain blended with the rustling of paper, sounding like the heartbeat of a blueprint nearing completion. I said quietly, firmly, "When this bridge stands, the ones who broke it will have nothing left to laugh about." Frank replied, his voice heavy like the final strike of a hammer, "Now justice has its blueprint, Rick." I left Frank's office in the rainy night, carrying the red-sealed evidence file. On the way back, I understood. Justice cannot sleep forever in a drawer. It was time for it to be seen, under the lights and in front of a crowd. The Seattle night spread its shine like a river of glass, wind from the bay sweeping across the high glass towers, reflecting the crystal lights of the Harbor Club, where the gala called A Night for Justice and Trust was taking place. I once kept those pieces of evidence in silence, because if submitted at the wrong moment, they would be dismissed. But tonight, with the arrest warrant signed, justice can be shown without asking anyone's permission. More than 200 guests from the legal and investment circles packed the hall, soft jazz blending with clinking glasses and the smiles of people who believed they were standing on top of the world. On stage, Martin Cole wore a black tuxedo, Lorraine in a pearl-studded white gown, smiling brightly under the lights. Behind them, the words, "Celebrating Integrity in Law," glowed across the LED screen. Martin raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate not only success, but trust, the thing that allows justice to exist." The entire hall applauded like thunder. Lorraine held his hand, tilting her head with a radiant smile. But no one noticed the man sitting silently at the back table, hidden in the lamplight, Rick Ashford. He had an old gray suit, a slightly crooked tie, and a hand holding a small silver USB in his pocket. Beside him, Colton Reeves, disguised as a sound technician, gave a slight nod. Rick slowly stood up. The sound of the wooden chair scraping the floor slipped through the music. He walked toward the control booth, the lights reflecting off his time-worn face. 3 days before the event, I had met with Graham Whitfield, Harbor Club's technical manager, who had once worked with me on an old construction project. When he heard about the case, he only said, "I'll help. I can arrange for your guy to check the audio system." That night, Colton brought the USB, the file labeled Sponsor Audio It Out MP4, and plugged it into the backup port. Graham nodded. "When you give the signal, one press is all it takes. The entire hall will see the truth. And now is that moment." As Martin continued his speech, smooth and confident, Rick said quietly, "Turn it on." Colton pressed the button. The sound system suddenly crackled, the speakers letting out metallic static. The hall froze. The giant screen behind the stage flickered, a white beam sweeping across Martin's and Lorraine's faces. The first frame appeared, footage from the Bellevue Hotel camera. Martin and Lorraine sat close together at a table, holding hands, laughing. Martin's voice echoed through the speakers. "When the divorce is over, everything will be under your name. He'll never figure it out." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, several people raising their phones to record. But that was only the beginning. The screen switched to white text. Victim Statement 01, Evelyn Foster. A gray-haired woman with tired eyes sitting in a small room. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "My name is Evelyn Foster. Martin Cole told me to sign a temporary authorization to protect my assets. 1 month later, I lost my home. And today I want to say clearly, Martin Cole, you destroyed my life." The murmurs grew louder. Martin stepped back, his face paling. Lorraine squeezed his hand, whispering something, but the mic caught her voice. "Turn it off, Martin! Turn it off!" The screen changed again. Victim Statement 02, Rosa Nguyen. Rosa stood in her nail salon, a small sign behind her. Her voice was sharp. "Martin Cole, I trusted you to protect my assets after the divorce, but you only protected yourself. I kept the facts from Cole Strategic Group, LLC. Here, evidence that money from my account went into your company." She held up the facts to the camera. The image zoomed in on the bold line. "From Cole Strategic Group, LLC, $47,500. The entire hall went silent. A retired judge in the front row set his wineglass down and whispered, "Good God." The third image appeared. Victim Statement 03, David Morrison, contractor. A middle-aged man in work clothes spoke straight into the camera. "Martin Cole, you're not a lawyer, you're a fabricator. I was one of 7 people you turned into abusers to seize assets. Today I don't want money. I just want you to hear my name, the man you erased from his own life." His voice struck the hall like a hammer. Then the screen displayed the Ashford Evidence Pack board, red arrows connecting the names Martin Cole, Lorraine Ashford, Cole Strategic Group, LLC, 7 divorce fraud cases, 2018 to 2023. In the center, the words, Pattern of fraud, confirmed by forensic audit. Robert Kingsley and Frank Douglas. Spotlights hit the stage, illuminating Martin's ghost-white face. He tried to shout, "Who authorized this? Turn it off!" Rick took the microphone, his calm voice spreading through the hall. "No one needs permission to speak the truth. They only need more courage than the silence you taught them." The hall was breathless, and just as Martin lunged toward the control booth, the sound of police sirens blasted outside. The glass doors shook. Blue and red lights swept across the ceiling. 3 patrol cars stopped at the entrance, the U.S. Marshal logo gleaming through the rain. The chief marshal's voice boomed through the microphone like a hammer. "Martin Cole, you are under arrest for financial fraud, evidence fabrication, and collusion to misappropriate assets. Lorraine Ashford, accomplice in the case." Lorraine stepped back, screaming, her wine glass shattering. Martin's face drained of blood, stammering, "This is a misunderstanding. Rick stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "No, Martin, this is the truth, and you are just learning its first lesson." The marshals cuffed them. The click of metal echoed coldly. Camera flashes exploded. The first hashtags appeared on guest phones. "Lawyer liar. Justice. In Seattle, Ashford case." Rick turned away and descended the steps, golden light reflecting off his silver hair. As he passed the front row, a reporter whispered, "Mr. Ashford, do you have anything to say?" He stopped, his voice quiet but carrying through the hall. "I didn't come to take revenge. I came to return justice to where it was stolen." The doors opened. Seattle rain fell sideways. Rick stepped out, carrying nothing but the envelope still sealed with red wax. Behind him, police sirens faded, their lights reflecting on the Harbor Club's glass wall, where justice had just been lit by real light. Wind from the bay swept through. Rick lifted his head toward the city. In the rain, his voice rose, slow and resolute. "Justice does not need an invitation. It only needs someone brave enough to turn on the light in a room full of lies." The screen faded to black, leaving only the reflection of crystal lights on puddles, like fragments of truth washed clean by a storm. The next morning, Seattle woke up in a storm of news, with every local television channel reporting on the shocking arrest at the Harbor Club, showing the image of Martin Cole being led away in handcuffs again and again between the anchors' voices, saying things like, "A prominent Seattle attorney arrested in the very event honoring justice," and "Victims speak out. Verified evidence. The largest divorce fraud case in the state," while news vans filled 3rd Avenue and reporters knocked on the door of the apartment I rented, and my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, left a box of pastries on my step and whispered, "I used to doubt you, Rick. I'm sorry now." I only nodded and closed the door without speaking, looking at the stack of morning papers on the table with the bold headline, "Justice Returns to Seattle. The Ashford Case," above a photo of me leaving the Harbor Club lobby with the lights reflecting across my face, something I don't remember being taken and don't need to know. In the afternoon, my phone rang, and on the other end was Rebecca, my daughter, her voice shaking as she said, "Dad, I saw everything. I was wrong to believe Mom. I thought your silence meant guilt," but her voice breaking into sobs, and I gently told her, "You don't need to apologize, Rebecca. Truth finds its way home." Then the line went quiet, except for her faint breathing like wind against a window. That evening my phone rang again, and it was Daniel, my son, saying, "Dad, my company was saved from bankruptcy today by a new investor. I found out it was the Ashford Heritage Fund. It was you, wasn't it?" And I only gave a small smile without answering, and after a long silence he whispered, "I'm proud to carry the Ashford name," before hanging up, leaving my chest warm and aching because my children had finally begun to see, even if late. Outside, the rain started falling, tapping against the glass like the heartbeat of the city, streetlights reflecting across the wet pavement. In long amber streaks, like time washing itself clean, and I opened my leather notebook with my old pen trembling slightly as I wrote only one line. Forgiveness doesn't erase wrongdoing, but it lets the soul breathe. Then set the pen down and looked out at the rain-soaked city, with windows glowing faintly and the wind curling around the buildings like the first breath of a new season. And somewhere within the sound of the rain, I could hear an imagined judge's gavel, an omen for the final hearing where justice would be written without lies. And in the warm yellow lamplight, I whispered to myself, "Justice is awake now. It's time for it to speak." 3 months after the night at the Harbor Club, the King County Court reopened a special hearing titled State of Washington versus Martin Cole et al. And that morning, Seattle was cold and damp, with dozens of reporters lining up outside the lobby and camera flashes streaking across the large glass panels as I stood silently on the courthouse steps wearing my old gray suit, the one that had witnessed the day I lost everything, bringing it back now to witness something else. The day justice spoke. Inside, the air was dense, every seat filled, reporters' tables cluttered with recorders and laptops. And in the petitioner's row, Kingsley sat beside me with a calm expression, a thick file labeled in red, Ashford evidence pack verified set before him. The new judge, Evelyn Carter, known for strictness and integrity, opened the session with her clear voice echoing through the microphone. Today we review Ashford vs. Ashford, 2024, on the basis of fraudulent litigation. The court demands absolute transparency. And Kingsley rose with his deep, steady voice, striking each word like a hammer, as he said, "Your Honor, we present the full record, proving fabrication of evidence, including emails between Martin Cole and Lorraine Ashford, altered financial statements, results of digital forensic analysis, and testimony from investigator Colton Reeves, who directly collected the originals. And the courtroom screen displayed emails, reading, 'Make sure the bruises look real. The doctor will sign off.' And transfer the amount via Cole Strategic Group, LLC. He'll never trace it," sending ripples of murmurs through the room as Lorraine bowed her head and gripped the edge of the table while Martin Cole, seated at the defendant's bench, turned pale and avoided my gaze. Colton testified in an even voice without emotion. I confirmed that I tracked, recorded, and seized these original documents under federal investigative orders. And Kingsley stepped to the podium, resting his hand on the final file, saying, "Your Honor, this is a systemized chain of fraud that led the court to issue a wrongful judgment. We request a declaration of fraud upon the court and full restoration of all property rights to Mr. Rick Ashford." And the courtroom fell utterly silent, except for the clerk's pen tapping, as Judge Carter examined the thick file, turned a few pages, then looked up with the light from the window behind her, reflecting across her face as she spoke in a low, decisive tone. "This court finds clear and convincing evidence of fraud upon the court," pausing to look directly at Martin Cole before saying, "The prior divorce decree is entirely vacated. All assets, including 3 houses, vehicles, and related accounts, are restored to the petitioner, Mr. Rick Ashford," followed by the gavel striking, one sharp crack, echoing through the room and blending with the burst of camera shutters outside as I sat still, hands gripping my knees, feeling a weight lift from my body after years of pressure, tears falling not from victory, but release. And Kingsley placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "You see, Rick, justice doesn't die. It just waits for the right person to wake it." While I looked out the courthouse window at the quiet Seattle rain, each drop breaking on the glass like the whispers of souls once deceived, now finally at peace. The final sentencing morning took place at the Seattle Federal Court, the sky cold and gray like the very road they had chosen, and I sat in the gallery, silently watching the 2 people who had once destroyed my dignity step before the bench. Martin Cole, once praised as the legal star of Seattle, now wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, with his hands cuffed and his eyes empty, and Lorraine, once my wife, in a plain gray coat with a hollow face that still held its old pride, except that the smile was gone. The prosecutor rose with a cold, decisive voice, saying, Defendant Martin Cole engaged in fabrication of evidence, deception of the judicial system, and manipulation of the legal process to seize assets. Defendant Lorraine Ashford acted as accomplice, aiding and concealing the criminal conduct. And the courtroom was so quiet that the clerk's pen strokes could be heard clearly as Judge Hayes read the final sentencing. Martin Cole is sentenced to 22 years in prison and permanently stripped of his license to practice. Lorraine Ashford is sentenced to 9 years in prison and 2 years of supervised release after completion. All illicit proceeds are forfeited to compensate the victims. This sentence is based on multiple counts of fraud amounting to tens of millions of dollars and acts constituting fraud upon the court. The court aggregates sentences from 4 separate charges to a total of 22 years, and the gavel struck with a sharp crack, slicing through the air while camera flashes erupted, and in that moment Lorraine turned back with a light reflecting on her pale face as her trembling voice said, "I'm sorry," and I looked at her and calmly replied, "So am I," and she bowed her head as her shoulders shook while my heart felt as still as a winter lake. No anger, no hatred, only a deeply human exhaustion. They were led away through the narrow hallway with the chains clinking coldly until the steel door closed, and I knew the final chapter of the past had truly ended. Weeks later, I received an envelope stamped by Monroe Correctional Facility, and inside was a handwritten letter in the familiar slanted script. Rick, I know I do not deserve to hear forgiveness, but I still want to write these few lines. 2 years in prison have made me understand what I never understood in the 30 years I lived with you. Trust, once lost, cannot be bought back with tears. I let greed lead me and turned the man who loved me into an enemy and turned myself into a stranger. Martin used the law like a knife, and I used love like a rope that tightened around my own neck. If someday you think of me, I only hope you remember the old woman, the one who stood on the porch in 1987, smiling when you carved the words, Ashford Residence. I do not ask to see you again. I only hope you live in peace because you deserve that more than I do. And I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer, without replying, because forgiveness needs no words, and remorse needs no witness. The next day I signed the final document of my life, the founding papers of the Ashford Foundation for Legal Integrity, funded directly from the Ashford Heritage Trust, 1950, with the sole purpose of helping those deceived and bankrupted by legal fraud. And Kingsley asked, "You plan to use the entire amount?" And I smiled with a hoarse but firm voice. I do not need to get my money back. I need to get my faith in the law back. And outside the Seattle rain fell again with small drops, spreading into streaks of light under the street lamps, as I stood by the window watching the water slide down the glass, and realized justice is not retaliation. It is the moment one chooses to stand up without trembling before what is wrong. On the table lay the new bronze plaque engraved with Ashford Foundation for Legal Integrity, built with truth, given with grace. And I touched the words, built with truth, cool beneath my fingers, yet somehow warm, because for the first time in years, I knew I had built something no one could break. 1 year after the sentence was handed down, Seattle had changed. Spring returned. The rows of maples along Union Avenue bloomed all at once, and the name Ashford Foundation appeared in news reports as a symbol of something rare in the legal world, real justice. And in just 12 months, the foundation had helped more than 30 people win cases in fraudulent divorces, helping them reclaim assets, dignity, and trust. And the press called it the Ashford phenomenon, where money was not used for revenge, but to straighten a scale that had been bent. That evening I had dinner with Rebecca and Daniel by Union Lake. the water reflecting the sunset like a sheet of molten gold. Rebecca laughing while serving food to her little son, and Daniel talking about a new project in Portland with a calmer, steadier voice than before. Children's laughter mixing with the soft sound of waves on the shore. And no one mentioned the past. Perhaps there was no need. We had walked through it and left it where it belonged, behind us. On the small wall of the patio, I had just hung a new bronze plaque, reading, Ashford Heritage Foundation, built with truth, given with grace, the engraved words catching the late afternoon light, and I stood looking at it for a long moment before gently wiping the thin layer of dust on the corner, the dust of time and years of wounds I had walked through. When night fell, the wind from Puget Sound blew through, carrying the salt and damp metallic scent of the port, and I stepped onto the balcony looking at the city lights. And in that wind, I remembered the words of my grandfather, Harold Ashford, who created the trust in 1950. Bad men can take everything they see, but they can never steal what they do not know exists. And now I understood he was not only speaking of money or property, but of integrity, something that cannot be confiscated, cannot be forged, and needs no court to validate. I looked up at the sky where the moonlight fell across the lake, stretching into a faint silver path, and I smiled softly and said, as if speaking to my grandfather, to myself, and to all the souls who had found rest at the end of this journey, now you can rest. And I closed the balcony door while the moon still reflected on the lake, with waves lapping steadily like the heartbeat of someone living again after the storm. Justice, I realized, is not an explosion. It is the quiet light on the horizon guiding those who were lost back home. If you have ever lost everything to a lie, ever been forced out of the place you built with your own hands, remember that justice never disappears. It only waits for someone hurt enough to seek it. Rick Ashford walked out of his own home with empty hands, but carried something stronger than all assets, the belief that truth always finds its way back. And if you believe that justice can be buried, but never erased, leave a single dot in the comments so I know you still believe in what is right. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next chapter, where the man who lost everything begins to reclaim justice from the dark itself. Because sometimes the light does not shine from the tallest building, but from the small room of someone who refuses to surrender.